the Christian artist, like Christ, had to step up to the abyss, and perhaps it's going into the abyss, following Christ, that one embraces it and attempts to redeem it in some way. And perhaps the writing of music, the making of art, is a kind of metaphor for the incarnation, for Christ's presence on earth, in that desire to redeem humanity, to redeem history and the future, can be replicated in small ways in a piece of music.
Good afternoon. My name is Margarita Mooney Clayton. I'm an associate professor of congregational studies in the Department of Practical Theology at Princeton Theological Seminary. I'm delighted to be here in the studios at Princeton Theological Seminary with my distinguished guest, Sir James MacMillan, composer and conductor. James is here on our campus as part of an initiative of the Catholic Sacred Music Project to train a new generation of composers. The Scala Foundation, which I direct, is one of the patrons of this fantastic event that has brought 30 young musicians together with 5 master composers, conductors, and choral conductors. We will be hosting a public event on Saturday, June 15th that will feature Sir James on a panel with me and Peter Carter, as well as feature the new compositions made by these young students. I started the Scala Foundation in 2016 to promote beauty in education and in the liturgy. Here in my classes at Princeton Theological Seminary, to my surprise, the topic that has most intrigued students is music. What is the place of music in our own personal spiritual journey? And what is the place of music in how we worship? And what's the relationship between popular culture, popular music, and life's most important questions about silence, pain, suffering, and faith? So we're going to talk a little bit today about your autobiographical essays, which you published. What is the title of the book? A Scotsman's Journey? A Scots Journey?
It's called A Scots Song.
A Scots song. Well, that makes sense now, doesn't it?
Yeah.
A Scots song.
Yeah.
And what led you to begin to share some of your own personal story and vocation and faith publicly as a composer and a conductor?
Well, that particular volume, very short little book, it's hardly an autobiography. It's just a sketch of certain things that have happened in my life and certain lines of thinking throughout my life. Came about because I was 60 in 2019, and one of the Scottish publishers asked me to write a short series of reflections to mark the 60th birthday. My music was being featured at the Edinburgh Festival that year in quite a significant way, so the book was written as an accompaniment to what was happening at the Edinburgh Festival. But it did allow me to put down in print a number of my thoughts and experiences as a musician over my life, and that life of music has been shaped and indeed touched by matters of faith and religion. And in fact, I write about the connection between music and religion. I reflect on that a lot in my public talks and debates, because I do believe there's a kind of umbilical link between music and the spiritual, and many of my friends and colleagues in the world of music who don't necessarily share my outlook on life, and certainly not my religion, will talk about music as being the most spiritual of the arts. And when they say that, that's saying something profound and true. They may not want to explore it in very specific ways, certainly not the way I would, but I think it's an acknowledgement of something that we all share in the world of music, an acknowledgement that music is a profoundly spiritual art force, perhaps the most spiritual of the arts, although many would debate that with me. But certainly there is something about music which opens a window or a door onto the divine. And when you put it as specifically as that with the agnostic and even the atheist, they will not necessarily disagree. They know that there is something about music that opens themselves up to these profound experiences. There's something about music that gets into the crevices of their souls and allows them to be transformed and changed. And that's why music is the great unifier. It brings together people of different faiths and none, different cultural backgrounds, and allows them to share a deep spiritual truth.
Well, let me ask you a little bit more about that, because I was surprised to read in your essays that you are a Scotsman, you're a man of faith. But what I hear you saying is that even your secular colleagues in the music world, even those who may identify as agnostic or perhaps even atheist about faith, use the language of spirituality to describe the human experience of music. Mm-hmm. And so you say that they don't really debate you when you say things like music is a window to the divine. Mm. And I find that incredibly interesting, because as an educator, what I've seen before I was teaching here at Princeton Theological Seminary, I was teaching in sociology at Yale University and also the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. And I do remember one student in particular, though this happened many times, this one student said that he was interested in exploring Christianity. He had no faith background. His parents were agnostic from China. And he said that when he began to believe that there was a God was when he attended a Christian music service, because he said, in that moment of making music together, I experienced something that was distinctly not me and not human. It was something divine. Mm. Now, he didn't have the formation to know what that was. But again, I find not only do music composers speak like this, mm-hmm. but that people who themselves are not trained in music, nonetheless, something incredibly profound happens to the human heart when we experience music. Mm-hmm. And how do you, as a musician and a person of faith, can you explain that?
I don't know if I can explain it, but it's certainly an area that is worth exploring from a number of different perspectives. And I think you're right, when people of different religious worldviews who share a love of music get together in their shared love of music at a concert, attending concerts of music that they love. The culture wars which so disfigure our society just now seem to fade away. The rows and the debates about these things don't matter when you're confronted with something as beautiful as the sound of music, the shaping of music into grand narratives which tell the story of our lives, but tells mysterious stories of which we do not know yet. And I think it's that sense of mystery and the undefinable nature of music that makes the agnostic less dogmatic when it comes to the question of music. And it revolves around this question about what is music, because music isn't a thing like this table is a thing, or I am a thing, or you are a thing. It's something that lacks thingness, and in a sense that's a description of God. That music is in the ether of our lives. You can't eat it, you can't taste it, you can't see it, you can't touch it, but yet it is this force in the universe, force in our private and public lives that does seem to touch us deep in the core of our being and bring about transformation, brings about changes in the way that we see our world, changes in our relationships. We sense a sense of evolution in our own private selves through the influence of music. And it has a social dimension as well. It brings us together. To celebrate, to dance, to worship God. All these things are truths about music which points to the deep spiritual nature of the art form. And another thing that makes it difficult for the skeptic, especially the aggressive skeptic, to take issue with that understanding of music as a spiritual art form is that the search for the sacred never went away in music in the 20th century, when in other art forms perhaps that could be argued was the case. During the great period of the retreat of faith, the great composers of our age kept the flame alive. Many of them did, and you could argue that many of the great composers in modernity were men and women of faith. Stravinsky was as conservative in his theology as he was revolutionary in his music making, but he was a man of faith. He set the Mass, he set the Psalms, he wrote little prayers, he fell in love with the Catholicism that he encountered in the West. And then that other great polar opposite in early modernism, Schoenberg, Arnold Schoenberg, the great 12-note composer, the serialist, reconverted to a practicing Judaism after he left Germany in the 1930s, and his later works reflect that Jewish culture, Jewish spirit, Jewish understanding of God. And so the story goes on. In my own country, Benjamin Britten wrote great religious-infused works. In France, with the likes of Olivier Messiaen and Francis Poulenc, whose great opera was Dialogue of the Carmelites, which was a huge challenge to secular assumptions of our age and of the past. And all those composers that came after Shostakovich from behind the Iron Curtain, Arvo Pärt, Henryk Górecki from Poland, Schnitke, were profoundly religious figures who had to face up to repression by the state atheism that marked their culture and their society. So you could say that this search for the sacred, sometimes in the face of huge adverse conflict and opposition, has maintained music and has been one of the basic elements of music through modernity, and it continues to this day.
That's absolutely fascinating, but what you're saying resonates with me on multiple levels. That what I hear you saying is that even in 20th century modernist music, which is not known for being overtly religious or sacred, many of the composers in their own personal lives turn back to faith of some sort. And it sounds like you're saying that music, your description of music as opening us up to the divine, because, well, God is a being who is in all things, yet beyond things, and he's not a material being, yet he comes to us. And so music, I think, if I heard you correctly, helps us to know the divine through its very form, which is very intimate to us, yet not something we can possess. It's beyond us, but yet it's intimate to us. Does that sound right?
I think so. Even musicians continually ask themselves the question, what is music and what is the purpose of music? And we never get to any answers, but there are some things that happen in our lives which point us in that direction. I run a little festival back home in Scotland called the Cumnock Tryst. It's based in the little town where I grew up. And we spend a lot of our time working with stricken communities. Cumnock and East Ayrshire is an area of multiple deprivation. It's not a place where high arts music festivals usually happen, but that's where I grew up. It's where I became a musician. My grandfather was a coal miner and a euphonium player. He got me my first cornet and took me to my first band practices. I remember it as a place where people loved music. There was no money and no wealth in that place, but there was a great love of music. And in taking back music to that community, I deliberately tried to find elements within that community where I know that love of music will be embraced. and discovered anew. We spend a lot of time working with special needs children and adults, disabled children, and one way or another. And I remember one day we were in this classroom, and what we do with the disabled children and adults is we bring special instruments into the class. They're electronic things, and sometimes it just requires the slightest touch to set off a welter of sound, notes and sonic material. Sometimes it's just a little iPad that they can touch and feel their way in, and it sets off sounds. And the improvisations that emerge from these people who are profoundly disabled physically and intellectually, in conjunction with the professional musicians and composers that work with them, can sometimes be very, very beautiful and surprisingly mysterious. And there was one day we were making music in a class of young people who had many, many problems. And I really felt that the music was something profound and indeed beautiful and mysterious and surprising. And at the end of it, there was a little boy, 12 years old or something, and his teachers had said he was non-verbal and uncommunicative. And he immediately he turned to the window and looked out, and the sun was shining through, and he said, "God is listening to this music." And it was an amazing moment of revelation for us all. And maybe there was something about that little boy who got hold of the great question, an answer to a question that we've always been asking. What is this music? We don't know what it is, but maybe God hears it. And if that's the case, that points to the music of the making of music as a profound act of praise. We praise God through music. Now, those of us involved in the church and the churches know that is a purpose of music in the liturgy and in the divine praises. But maybe it's beyond the church. Maybe it's in the world itself. Because when our world, our society, looks at music, they say, why do that? There's no use to music. It's not a thing, as we say. But it's not a gateway to power. It's not a gateway to riches. Yes, it can be exploited commercially, of course. But what is it that motivates young people to become music in the first place? It's not these instrumentalist economic issues. It's something much more profound and centralised. It's something beyond us, as you say. And maybe it's the instinct to praise God, which is at this core of what music is. Now, in the churches, we know that because that's what it does. But maybe in the world, that's what music is there for. And that is the most, I would say, most profound and moving thing about the art form. It points to the deep spirituality of music. Music is the most spiritual of the arts.
That is amazing. So what I hear you saying is that music is an art form that is accessible universally, even to people who might be otherwise labeled as disabled intellectually or physically. I think you've also said it now a few times that music is unitive, across culture, across class. I would add maybe across time, but we can talk to that. So music is accessible, music is unitive, but yet without having read a Scots song and knowing your biography, most people associate the world of classical music with something very elite and something very exclusive. So can you explain a little bit how a Scotsman from a small town became one of the top 5 living composers whose work is performed today? How were you educated and brought into this world of classical music that you're now bringing back to people, both in your hometown through the, is it the, how do you say it?
The Cumnock Triste.
The Cumnock Triste, as well as through your work with the Catholic Sacred Music Project. So how did you receive this great formation you have, and how are you bringing it back both to your local community as well as to the global community of music?
Well, I remember the day when one of our teachers brought in a batch of little plastic recorders, and they handed them around. I was about 8 or 9 years old at the time, and for most school children it's not the seismic moment that it was for me. But something, I remember a light going on. I got this little thing in my hand, started making noises on it, and within days I knew that I wanted to play more instruments, different instruments like the trumpet and so on. But the desire to write my own music, that is, create music from scratch, came simultaneously with those events. My mother and, as I say, my grandfather knew about the great composers, so I immediately started asking them about composers, started reading the Ladybird books of great composers.
This was age 8, and you're asking your parents and your grandparents about composers?
Yes, absolutely, because I realised, and they told me that the music is made by human beings who write it down, and their houses were full of old music. My mother had played the piano when she was younger. My grandfather, as I say, had played band music and sung in local Catholic church choirs and so on. So I was finding all this music and asking about it. Who was Chopin? Who was Beethoven? And so there was a curiosity there, which would not be quenched. And I'm sure that is the case in many different communities. If one is lucky enough to live in a community or in a home where there is money to encourage it, that young person will be encouraged to follow a life in music. It's more difficult where there is no money. I certainly acknowledge that, and that is one of the big barriers.
But that was the case in your family. There wasn't money to support this career.
Nothing was going to stop me. Nothing was going to stop me. I didn't know I was poor. I didn't know the family was poor. I lived in a little rural part where there was not much connection with the world outside. But I knew that great composers from the past had produced music. Some of them had no money at all. And that there were composers in our time, that's the late 1900s, the late 20th century, that were still composing music in this tradition, one of whom just lived a few hundred miles down the road from me in England. His name was Benjamin Britten. So I became obsessed with the idea that music was not just a museum culture, that is something that existed in the past, made in the past, but could be made by people in the present as well. Carrying through a tradition, maybe even carrying through a sense of lineage from the deep past to the present. So that's where I went with music, and I've had a wonderful, I'm having a wonderful life in music and going all over the world and seeing just how widespread the love of music is. But I've always wanted to bring it home in some ways to that little community and to build something special in East Ayrshire, and that's what I think we're doing with the Covenant Trist, with which we now celebrate our 10th birthday this year.
That's beautiful. Wow. So you were seized by the idea of becoming a composer at age of 8. And I know from reading your essays that you were involved in choral music, which is where you met your wife. And, you know, a lot of what you're saying about music as fundamental to the human experience of the world and the experience of God and being cross-cultural resonates with me because I grew up here in the United States, but my mother had come to the United States from Cuba when she was 20. And she was very musical, a lot of vocalists, and she played guitar, folk music, some Cuban, but actually much of it Mexican. I didn't know the difference as a child, but it was just all in Spanish, folk music. And so so the love of music was something that we had in our home, that my mother was always singing. She still walks around singing all the time. And I was involved in choir, choral activities, and I loved music. So when I did some of my work abroad in Central America and post-war reconstruction in El Salvador, Nicaragua, as well as my first book in Haiti, I found that singing was a great way to build community with people with whom I was arguably very different, coming from this Ivy League university, having access to resources. But something magical or mysterious happens when you get together and sing with people who are very different from you.
Yeah.
It, as you said, is an expression of praise of God, an expression of celebration. And also there's a sense of a profound unity that emerges from that singing together with music.
Yeah.
And so I realized, as you were saying, that although people may have very different socioeconomic backgrounds or class backgrounds, music is something that may not have a material existence or even a material value, but yet has this profound impact on us, inside of us, but also in the kind of community that we can build and in how we praise God. Mm-hmm. And so like you, I began to wonder, as I experienced this, right, I was really reintroduced to my love of music in these battlefields of Central America and in these poor villages in Haiti. And I thought, how did I leave behind that love of music? Well, I pursued an intellectual career. Mm-hmm. And music was something that it seemed was very common in the math department, but that might be another conversation. But the experience of beauty was largely absent from the intellectual world that I inhabited. So I've been trying now to learn from people such as yourself why music belongs in education, why it belongs in work with the poor, why it belongs with the disabled, why music is actually fundamental to human existence and to human happiness and praise. And so all of the experiences that you describe and that you've had as a composer and a conductor are helping me to understand this love of music that I very much deeply had. Mm-hmm. And I hope that with the work that you're doing, there's a chance to revive music as fundamental to education. Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, that's an ongoing discussion all over the world. Anxieties about education, what's happening in education, and where music should find its place in education. In some places, music has been edged out because it's not one of the basics. It's not seen as to be important to the social and economic development and direction of society. Whereas I would say, and I think you've alluded to it, that it should be one of the basics because it helps the cognitive faculties. It helps you make sense of the world. It helps make you understand abstract constructions. It's an abstract art form in itself, of course, but it also socializes people from an early age. It allows them to communicate collaboratively in bands and in choirs and in orchestras. It brings people together. It allows people to build a sense of a shared direction, maybe even a shared identity. And all music does that. Folk music, as you say, especially, it's deeply ingrained in the history and the traditions of many ordinary people. And out of folk music, of course, in the Eurocentric sense, you could say that the art music has grown. You can again draw links between the way that the art music of the last 100 years in Europe and now in America and lots of other places had its influence from the music of the people. Composers in the past knew that. You can hear the influence of folk song in the music of Beethoven and Schubert, of course, and perhaps the sense of separation of the high and the low is not as profound or as difficult as we sometimes make it out to be.
Right. So I think what you're saying, and this is a really important point, you just said that the separation between the low and the high, right? So tell us a little bit more about that, because you are, as we mentioned, a composer of you compose classical music, you've composed some music for the liturgy, you are involved in folk music. So, and some of those forms are considered high, some of them are considered folk. But you said they're not as separate as one might think that they are. Is that correct?
I've never seen it that way. I mean, you've talked about a lot of different kind of musics there, but they are, even in the life of one person, can be interconnected. I mean, I studied, and we use this word classical, but sometimes it's a difficult and misleading word, because it can sometimes mean something very specific, or it can mislead people into what its purpose is. I call it art music. music that has accrued a higher purpose, a higher aim through tradition and history and evolution. I've learned music at a high level. I've learned to write music. I've learned to play music through quite a rigorous training. That is a given. It's a necessity in arts music. But I've also been involved in Scottish and Irish folk music. There are styles of music, traditions of music that mean a lot to me. As a Scottish little boy, I grew up with Scottish country dancing, and the sound of Scottish fiddle music and bagpipes just surrounded everything about my upbringing, and I wanted to be involved in that, both as a player and as a singer. I loved it. One is able to delve deeply into the folk traditions and history of music, and for an art composer that can actually inform what we do, and that's always been the case. The great composers like Mozart and Beethoven and Schubert were aware of the folk traditions, the folkish traditions, the vernacular musics of their time, the vernacular musics that you would have heard in the street or in the field, and that all fed into their art music and the way that they took that music in particular directions. That's still ongoing, and I feel that my work as a composer has been informed and shaped by being Scottish and having grown up with Scottish traditional music and the sound of bagpipes and so on. The other thing that you mention is sacred music and liturgical music, and there's a whole discussion to be had there about what makes what is sacred music. Some people would say that all music is sacred because it's a sacred art form, but writing for the liturgy, especially as a practicing Catholic, is a very specific way of creating sacred music. It's sacred music for not just for the love of God, the praise of God, but when one writes music for the liturgy, one writes sacred music for the divine praises, there's a huge responsibility on that composer to create music which carries the thoughts and indeed the prayers of the praying person, the praying assembly as it were, to the very altar of God. And that's a huge responsibility. And that's different, I think, from what happens when we write music for the concert hall. There are connections, of course, and we want to carry the thoughts and indeed the deep reflections of all the listeners. But I write sacred music for the concert hall as well. Is that a problem? Who would it be a problem for? It's certainly not a problem for me. And I'm delighted, again, it's this plurality and generosity of the music community. They're also a knowledgeable community in that they know that their musical culture has largely been shaped by Judeo-Christian civilization, and some of the great works of music from the past and perhaps even the present have been written for the glory of God, either directly for the liturgy through the setting of the sacred texts. One of the great artworks of our culture in music is the St. Matthew Passion and the St. John Passion by Bach, written specifically for Lutheran liturgy, and now given as a gift to history, a gift to the world, beyond the specifics of that congregation, that denomination, so that lovers of music can engage with it and embrace it and feel spiritually uplifted and fulfilled by music that has begun life in a very specific place, culturally and spiritually. So there's a great knowledge and respect amongst the music community of the Christian traditions, the Christian basis of our music culture, and that's made it a good place for me as a believing Catholic. I write the Passion settings. I've written a St. John Passion, I've written a St. Luke Passion. I write music inspired by Scripture, a Christmas oratorio, but these are works that are not performed in church, or certainly not performed for liturgy. They're performed for the concert world. And there's an ambiguity sometimes between, or in the mindset of the listener. Are we involved in a secular event, or are we involved in some sort of sacred, spiritual moment? although we are sitting in a concert hall listening to this great sacred work of art by Bach or Handel or Beethoven, we may indeed be communing with something profoundly beyond us, which in our understanding would be God.
It sounds like what you're saying, if I understand you, is that as a person of faith, we are inescapably always on the journey towards God, whether that's in folk music or music for the concert hall or music for the liturgy. Yet you seem to be saying, if I understand you correctly, that there is a certain tradition or even perhaps form of music which has a place in the liturgy. And that doesn't mean that the kind of music for the concert hall or a folk music is taking us away from God. It's maybe opening us up to God in a different way. And that's, of course, a debate, what is appropriate for the liturgy and what's the relationship between that and, concert hall music is, I think, a very lively discussion that often comes up in my classes here in Princeton Theological Seminary, where I'm training people who will be, pastors of churches. And so I wondered if we could turn perhaps a little bit more to flesh out some of these ideas to some of your own compositions. And I believe, which composition was it that you actually worked with academic theologians, Jeremy Begbie? Was that the St. John's Passion or the St. Luke's?
It was the St. Luke Passion. It's happened a couple of times. Jeremy Begbie, who's an extraordinary theologian and musician, contacted me a quarter of a century ago, asking me to be involved in a collaboration which involved a poet that I worked with anyway, Michael Simmons Roberts, and a theologian, and that theologian happened to be Rowan Williams, before he was Archbishop of Canterbury. And we worked in this kind of colloquia of discussion and understanding, which led to a piece of music. Now, I have many colleague composers who would have run a mile from that, would have been terrified at opening themselves up to that kind of, not just collaboration of other minds, but to a purpose that they had less control over, they would say. But I was intrigued by it and inspired by it, and eventually Jeremy Begbie came back to me with another suggestion of entering into even a wider colloquy of discussion involving a group of theologians on both sides of the Atlantic, at Duke and in Cambridge, to talk about a text that I really wanted to set, and that was the Passion according to St. Luke. And there's reasons why that came about, but I said yes, I wanted to hear what these experts on Luke had to say. If I was going to set these words, I wanted to take on board a lot of their expert insights. Why wouldn't I? It's a good way of learning and research, and composers do that themselves. Some composers want to do everything on their own, but why close down the possibility of being expanded intellectually and spiritually by the knowledge of others? So that's how this particular discussion grew about. And obviously, there's some things I liked what they said, some things I didn't like. But I took a lot of it on board, and I was able to set the St. Luke Passion in a way that would have been very different if that wider discussion hadn't taken place.
That's fantastic. And that eventually led to the founding of a program in theology and the arts at University of St. Andrews, is that right? Or was it part of that?
Well, Jeremy Begbie set up the Institute for Theology, Imagination and the Arts at St. Andrews round about this time, and eventually I became part of that. I'm not a theologian, but I've always been attracted by theologians. I've always been intrigued of what they've got to say, especially about music. And to hear theologians talking about the theology of music, I find it absolutely riveting and a way of expanding my own understanding of what I do. So to be associated with it was good for me. I think good for them as well, because they wanted to bring on board actual jobbing artists to take part in the project. And that's what I continue to do at St. Andrews.
Well, that's wonderful. And as I mentioned, that's part of the mission of the Scala Foundation. My job is teaching, of course, at Princeton Theological Seminary, but through the work of Scala and the events we host, we're precisely trying to bring musicians such as yourself or working artists into the dialogue with what's happening in theology as well as in education, where the artists are given a sense of place and respect as creators, composers, obviously, which you are, drawing on the great traditions. And one theologian that I think we both admire is Father Aidan Nichols, who says in one of his many books that, in fact, the understanding of theology and doctrine has to look at early art and music as a source for understanding what it is that we believe. So it's not simply that theologians develop doctrine which then tell the musicians what to do, but that the expressions of faith that have come to us through art and music themselves are a source of understanding the meaning of the faith.
Absolutely. And I think that musicians and other artists bring something to the world of the church that some aspects of the church have forgotten. The role of beauty in our divine praises, the role of beauty in the world is something that even in the church can be ignored. The church and its clergy and its preachers can talk a lot about truth, which is greatly appreciated, and they can talk a lot about goodness, but the one they don't talk a lot about is beauty, and it seems to be a strange omission that needs to be addressed. And perhaps artists that are involved in the church one way or another can bring something to that problem. We hope to deal with beauty in everything that we do. It's something that compels us to write music, to create poetry, to paint pictures, and some of us bring to that activity a wealth of tradition and centuries of knowledge and experience of artists who did that for the church. The church, for some reason, has sidelined beauty, and it needs to readdress it and to engage it, bring it back as one of the basics again. There's a triumvirate of attributes that need to be addressed. It's not just two things, there are three things. And beauty is one of those, that holy trinity of attributes that the church needs to re-engage with. And I have over the years begun to realise that there are people in the church and outside the church who realise that there's an issue here, and that something has to be done about it. And that's why I've been drawn to some of the people we've been talking about. And looking back on it now, my encounter with Father Aidan Nichols turned out to be an absolutely crucial one. And it's only very recently that I've begun to realise just how crucial it's been. I arrived at the University of Edinburgh aged 18 as a freshman, first year undergraduate, and one of the first people I met at Edinburgh was Father Aidan Nichols, who was there days into his first job, as it were, as the Catholic chaplain of Edinburgh University. And he was anything he said to me went right above my head, and in many ways still does. But I knew there was something about the charism, the Dominican charism, but also that intellectual charism that valued culture and the arts, which he did, that seemed to be the linchpin which connected my love of God with my love of music. And within days he had asked me to form a choir, a little schola, at the Catholic chaplaincy. His first book, The Art of God Incarnate, is dedicated to me, the undergraduate James MacMillan. A book which explores the theology of the arts, and in particular the book of the theology of modern art. I still find it very difficult to read, but I've worked very, very hard at it. And I think what the likes of Aidan Nichols has to say to the church and to the world of culture is vitally important, and will be seen to be prophetic of the way that the church and the world might go in the future.
Well, I certainly hope so. I think, James, that we've already covered one reason why beauty is absent from a lot of education, and that's because beauty, especially what you call art, music, or classical music, is thought of as somehow elitist. Mm-hmm. I think the other reason that we don't even hear much talk about beauty in the church is that it's thought that faith is, well, I guess the other reaction I get with beauty is that it's just too subjective to have a kind of shared concept of what that beauty is. Or sometimes the other thing that people say to me is, well, you know, what's really fundamental about the faith is the ability to deal with questions of pain and suffering. And what does beauty have to do with that, you know? And so one other theme that I have to say really moved me in a Scotsman song, a Scots song, was, I think you had a whole chapter dedicated to the theme of silence. And when I read that, I had not too long before encountered Robert Cardinal Sarah's book on the power of silence. He's a cardinal from Guinea who has was, I believe, the director of the Vatican's Congregation on the Liturgy, if I'm not mistaken. And I have here with me one of the articles that's an excerpt of his book that I have assigned to my students. And I wanted to, you know, wind down our time together today reflecting on music and silence and suffering and faith, because I think it's important to pierce through this idea that somehow music is an aesthetic, or what I took away from what you wrote, and you share, and thank you for sharing this very personal experience of your granddaughter who was born a sick young child and lived only to the age of 6, but that gave you time to develop a very profound relationship with her, and you discuss silence and suffering through your own experience of losing your granddaughter. But it really moved me because what I have found with so many young people that I work with, that silence is experienced as an abyss, a complete absence. Yet the way that you talk about music, right, you say in your own writing, reflecting on one of my favorite novels, right, Shishake Endo's novel, Silence. You say, and I quote, "Silence is not absence, but presence. It is the silence of accompaniment, of Christ accompanying us on the Via Dolorosa, suffering with us, as one of us, rather than as nihil, nothing. And the notion of silence as presence, as mystical or metaphysical substance, has many musical analogies."
Yes, and that's what I took from Endo's book, Silence, which is a difficult book to read, and now there's a film been made. It's an even more difficult film to watch, and it's about suffering. It's about cruelty, human cruelty. It's about the absence of God, the apparent absence of God, but it's in that absence that Endo suggests there is presence, and as you say, it's the presence of accompaniment. It's finding in the apparent, in the abyss, that that God is present, and that and Christ is there in the abyss, as he was on the cross, as he was in the tomb, and that's what Endo's characters encountered in the abyss of silence, in the book. And I responded to that by writing a symphony called Silence. It seemed like a paradoxical name for a piece of music, but it was an attempt in music, it's my third symphony, to try to come to terms with that, because many musicians have realised that there's an umbilical link between music and silence. That it's in the silence of our own hearts that the music begins, again paradoxically. It's in a state of absence that the seeds of music, the little embers of music, are fanned into being. The little flames and flickers of nothing to begin with can flicker and be fanned into these massive big narratives, symphonic narratives. And so there has to be a respect on the part of the composer for this sense of silence, because we find our essence in it, not just as musicians and composers, but something of our humanity in the silence. And I think Endo is onto something when his characters at least suggest that they find the Via Dolorosa in that silence, and that Christ accompanies us in the silence. And sometimes those silences are difficult, and I fully understand the young people that you speak to regard it as an abyss to be avoided. Who would want to go to the abyss? It's in the abyss that we find Auschwitz and so on, and yet the Christian artist, like Christ, had to step up to the abyss, and perhaps it's going into the abyss, following Christ, that one embraces it and attempts to redeem it in some way. And perhaps the writing of music, the making of art, is a kind of metaphor for the incarnation, for Christ's presence on earth, in that desire to redeem humanity, to redeem history and the future, can be replicated in small ways in a piece of music.
Well, what I found so compelling about what you wrote was the importance of music, at least, and I can give some examples of this in my own life and my students, the importance of music in being able to prepare us to be in the silence. So, for example, I took students to a 3-hour prayer service run by the Franciscan Sisters of the Renewal. One of my cousins works with them, and they serve the poor, the homeless, people who have addictions, etc. And what struck me was that after, these students, by the way, were not Catholic, this was a Catholic service, but after this 2-hour service of singing and reciting the rosary and prayers of healing, after all of this movement and action, there was time for silence. And one student commented to me that it took her a full 2 hours of engaging in these embodied rituals to be able to sit in stillness before God, and that it had been the first time in a very long time she had experienced stillness and silence. And in that stillness and silence, she experienced as well the presence of God. And so what I think at times, and this certainly happens with me, right? When I experience the absence of God, I try to fill that somehow. Let me go fill it with, reading another spiritual book, or let me go listen to a song, or let me find something. Like, I try to run from that silence because it feels like an absence. But there have been times, I remember very distinctly, one time it was Palm Sunday, and I was traveling in Texas and found out that a former student of mine had lost his father to suicide. It was tragic, absolute tragedy. And I was going to meet with this student, and I went to the Palm Sunday Mass, and I did not know how I was going to face him or what I might possibly say to this kind of pain. But through that beautiful Palm Sunday liturgy, with the processions and the bells and the smells and the meditation on the Passion, and then the silence that comes in the liturgy, is when I felt this voice in my heart saying, you must be just the hands and feet of Christ to the suffering, right? And it gave me sort of that courage to remember that in that abyss, in that suffering, God is with us. And we are called to be present to the suffering because we have hope in the redemption, which is what you've just alluded to. And so rather than trying, and I think this is what Cardinal Sarah is warning against in his book, The Power of Silence, and I think it's also, really resonates with what you wrote. You say, silence is almost extinct. And the war against silence is a war against ourselves and against our interior life. So similarly, Cardinal Sarah, right, says, if we manage to be with God in silence, we possess what is essential. Only silence leads man beyond words to the mystery, to worship in spirit and truth. Silence is a form of mystagogy. It brings us into the mystery without spoiling it. So without reducing music to an instrumental means that we use, right? Because you've said this a few times, music is not fundamentally instrumental material, yet it has this profoundly transforming impact on us. What I find so interesting, what you've said about the war against silence and silence being almost extinct, that there's a way in which music, properly understood, helps prepare us to be in that silence and experience that silence as a fullness, not as an absence. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I think there's an analogy between the way that we listen to music, the way that we approach music, the way we need to approach some of the complex forms of music we've been talking about. There's an analogy between that and the world or the state of contemplation, meditation, and indeed prayer. There's something that connects the two. You need to be in a similar analogous state to music. And what I mean by that is that you need to open yourself to an objective authority in music, for the music to speak to you. There's no point in listening to a Beethoven symphony or have it on in the background if you're going to do something else. That music is not going to reach you. There's music and these complex narratives from classical history, from art history, have an authority that cannot be hurried. You must obey the structures and the timescale of these pieces of music. So in a sense, the listener cannot come into the presence of music in a state of defiance and resistance. You have to come in a state of openness, respect and love. And that's why lovers of music are transformed by music. Now, the analogy to that is prayer. You can't enter into the presence of God in a state of defiance and resistance. You have to be open to the possibility of being changed through what happens in that silence. So although music is a noisy thing, and it's a gloriously noisy thing, it does have a counterbalance, or it has a connection with the way we are in silence, and the way that silence is so important to us. In music, as in prayer, you have to sacrifice something of yourself. You have to give something up. You have to give something up of your ego, and in prayer, and your self-obsession. In music, what you give up is your time, your precious time, especially nowadays when our time is so controlled by outside forces. It's very, very difficult to find the time to put aside to listen to a Beethoven symphony, never mind give over a whole lifetime of devotion to music. So the connections between music and silence are profound, and they're explored by the likes of Endo, they're explored by Cardinal Sarah, and I'm sure they're explored in the thoughts and sometimes in the writings of composers. John Cage, even, the great American iconoclast, was onto something when he spoke about the role of silence. And his famous or notorious piece of his 4:33, which is 4 minutes 33 seconds of silence, which is a kind of quite a kind of it's a humorous thing in a way. It has been seen humorous, but it's a kind of challenge to the listening sensibilities, or lack of them, of our modern age. And he says that in this span of 4 minutes 33 seconds of silence, what may you encounter? Well, you begin to hear things. You can't go to a performance of 4:33 and hear nothing. Music doesn't exist in a vacuum, and it's the same with prayer. If you go into that state of silence, it's not a vacuum that you encounter. You may indeed encounter something coming back at you.
You express that so beautifully when you talk about your granddaughter, and I'll share here my reflection on reading about your experience with a granddaughter. Sometimes, I've never done this on an interview before, but I'm going to quote myself from what I wrote when reading your experience. I wrote, "Our music, our rituals, and the way we use our bodies have to respect the rhythms of silence, lest our longings for the infinite be drowned in the distractions of the superficial." And so what you said in your writing, and you've just said it now, is that sometimes when we respect the time and the silence and look into it, something looks back at us. And so you describe how, for example, gazing into the eyes of an icon, you talk about Rublev's icon of the Trinity, or maybe that's what I wrote in my notes, the Father staring into the Son's eyes, that when we look into the eyes of an icon, we're meant to see the beauty of the divine presence. And the icons become the window into the soul of God, and God looks back. And so when I read that and thought about the way that encountering music, as you've described it, or encountering art, prepares us for these inevitable tragic moments in life when we have to look at the death of a loved one or the suffering of a loved one. And you share how beautiful your granddaughter's eyes were and how much you missed just gazing at her eyes after she was gone. She passed away before her 6th birthday, but you wrote, remembering her gaze and reflecting on looking into her eyes, it was the cherisher, now quoting you, cherisher gazing at the cherished, the enchanter enchanting the enchanted, heart lost to heart, silence, listening to silence. And so what moved me so profoundly there was the memory of your granddaughter, the memory of her beautiful eyes, and how even though she was gone in a way, she's still present in that memory, and in that gaze, which is a gaze of heart to heart. And this sounds to me a lot like what you were describing about the encounter with God. God is not material, but yet he speaks to us through the eye of the soul. But we have to be prepared, formed to be able to enter into that silence and into that stillness, to feel in that stillness and that silence the profound presence of God, as you felt you still feel, I would imagine, the presence of your granddaughter with you.
Yes, absolutely. And eventually I had to get back to writing music. That compulsion never went away, and there were very, very silent and broken and difficult times in the weeks and months after all that happened. But suddenly, or certainly one day, it all began again, and it was an encounter with silence that allowed the little embers to come alive again. I went straight back to the page, and the next piece of music was absolutely infused with that unexpected experience, and I don't think I've been the same since.
Well, thank you for sharing that, because I want to end on this point that you were saying about contemplation and prayer and the work that you're doing on, culture, education, and music is so profound, both for the revitalization of culture, but also for the revitalization of faith and the human search for God in the infinite, in the abyss, and just the capacity to rejoice at the mystery that in that abyss, God comes to us. And that's why we can get up, and that's why we can celebrate. That's why we can experience this unity that, your life, your work, your story, your songs have been incredibly inspirational for me. And I'm delighted to be able to share that with the audiences here at Princeton Theological Seminary and the Scala Foundation. So thank you for your work in music and for your work in education and for sharing your life story and
You're very welcome.
your faith.
Thank you.